August 2021, a chaotic US withdrawal from Afghanistan leaves thousands of allies behind. 2 years on, nearly 100,000 refugees remain in limbo, their status uncertain. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. After 20 years of war and occupation, it was a chaotic departure from Afghanistan for the United States. 152,000 Afghans who worked alongside US forces remain trapped in the country. About 100,000 more are refugees in the United States, their status caught in a web of internal politics. Promises made but not kept, at least for now. Meanwhile, the Taliban marked the second anniversary of their return to power, celebrating the creation of a sectarian Islamic state. Zmaryalai Abasin has more from Kabul.
On August 30, 2021, the commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, Major General Chris Dunahua, boarded the last U.S. military flight out of Hamid Karzai International Airport in Kabul, Afghanistan. After 15 days of chaos, panic and drama, the U.S. and allied forces completed their withdrawal from the country. In early September 2021, the Taliban formed a government of their own, and all of the key positions went to the senior commanders of the group. The end of the large-scale conflict in Afghanistan in 2021 led to an improvement in overall security situation and a remarkable reduction in civilian casualties. According to the UNHCR, humanitarian aid has been able to reach all provinces, including many areas which had been inaccessible for decades. On the other hand, many challenges remain, particularly for women and girls. Secondary schools has been shut for girls. Female students are not allowed to go to universities, and women have limited access to work. The Taliban leadership says that the restrictions on women will continue until further notice. So there is no deadline set for when this nightmare for women will end in Afghanistan. According to a recent UN report, widespread food insecurity, soaring inflation, and high economic instability exacerbated by the sanctions and loss of aid, limited livelihoods, and more frequent and severe climate shocks are stated as the main challenges that Afghanistan is facing. The UNHCR has recorded over 1 million internally displaced persons, or IDPs, who have already voluntarily returned since the end of the conflict. An estimated 60,000 refugees and 680,000 IDP returns are anticipated by the end of 2023. No country has recognized the Taliban-led government yet. The group, now the de facto government of Afghanistan, was able to rule all over the country. Zmaryalai Abasin, CGTN, Kabul.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Brian Becker is the Executive Director of the Answer Coalition. Shah Mohibi is the founder and director of Rise to Peace, where he focuses on terrorism and extremism around the world. Also with us is Sanam Naragi Andalini. She heads the International Civil Society Action Network, a non-profit supporting women's peacemaking efforts in war-torn countries. And Omar Sadr previously worked at the Afghanistan Institute for Strategic Studies and served as an assistant professor at the American University of Afghanistan. He's currently a senior research scholar at the University of Pittsburgh Center for Governance and Markets. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Omar Sadr, let me start with you. Millions of Afghans fled the country after the Taliban returned to power. At least 100,000 of them, as I said, are right here in the United States. But their status is in limbo right now. They're waiting for some move by the United States Congress that will possibly pave the way for their residence here in the United States. What can you tell us about those who are waiting, those who have refugee status, but are waiting to see what their fate will be?
Well, thank you for having me. The status, as you mentioned, is a limbo. Many are waiting for their families to reunite. Many others are waiting to get a final settlement, lawful settlement in the United States. And the uncertainty also endangers them in terms of their work permit, because their work permit is going to expire and many will not be able to find or continue to work what they are doing now. This is a crisis. I think the issue has become quite politicized between the two parties. But the act, Afghan Adjustment Act, which was pushed by a bipartisan team, had support from both the parties. However, a few senators has certain reservations, which I think they had enough time to review and address those concerns. But after 2 years, still it seems that the political issues are dominating the lives of the people who have been allies of the United States. But I think the issue is much more greater than what is happening with the Afghan Adjustment Act. Mm-hmm. And the fact is that the United States immigration and refugee system is in a crisis. And I think in last month in the Aspen Security Conference, Secretary of Homeland Security highlighted the fact that the system is dealing with over around 6 million asylum cases, not only from Afghanistan, but from many other countries. My apologies, 2 million cases. And people who are waiting to receive a final judgment about their cases, many of them may wait over 6 years, around 6 years. So this may include many of those who came from Afghanistan. And it's not just about those who work with the military, but also, for example, civil society activists, human rights activists, academics, and many more.
Ahmad, the proposed legislation that Omar was talking about, the Afghan Adjustment Act, you worked on that, didn't you?
Yes, not only me, but there's a whole coalition of more than 200 people and organizations that initially proposed.
Now, as Omar pointed out, there is some political opposition to passing that act. Do you think, perhaps with amendments, that it will ultimately pass?
I'm not optimistic on that, how that's going to be passed, because Congress also would like to know from the executive branch on the vetting process and the huge reasoning behind the whole passment of AAA. I think it's more political than just let's pass that and have these people get into pathway to citizenship, which is a huge challenge right now. If you look at it, each asylum officer has piles of documents of every single person has come to the U.S. And they have to review, they have to interview, they have to make sure these people get to those, legal residence after, I don't know, like maybe like months or years. And then with the whole pro-release extension, I think that whole double effort thing and the cost just has to do with the policy, whether the policy is going to be shifted towards Afghanistan and what they're going to do.
But essentially it's about security, right?
In my opinion, it is security and also justification on, because there's a whole program or propaganda going on normalization of Taliban, US or Washington. There's a lot of lobbying groups working on that, which could fade the way that, why we should bring more people to the US while the Taliban could provide security, which is a false statement. I think that is why the world should not feed into those misperception.
Okay, Sanam, great to have you with us. Now, 2 years ago, you wrote a piece in Newsweek, a column, in which you said, and I'm quoting you here, you said, in 20 years of occupation, few in Washington have respected Afghans as equals. Those who supported the US war were evacuated, but those who built peace, fostering justice and democracy were not. What happened?
Thank you. So first of all, I think that, the work that we've done has been specifically looking at women and the role of women. And if you think about the efforts to get women into the Afghan police force, into the army, women as lawyers, women as judges, women journalists, the civil society groups that we worked with who are working across the country, all of these people were building peace in the country. And all of them were forgotten. There was no effort whatsoever made to consider women principles. And the things. Imagine being a senior police officer, a female police officer or army officer, and being left behind, and the implications of that in terms of how the Taliban is treating them. The safety and lives of those women were kind of thrown on our shoulders. We took it up, and we continue to try and help women get out. But the real tragedy is that the United States used the issue of women's rights as an excuse to go into Afghanistan in 2002, and it betrayed Afghan women on its way out, and it continues to betray them, and it's across the board, bipartisan, especially in terms of the former U.S. envoy to Afghanistan, Mr. Khalilzad, who actually broke U.S. law, because we have something called the Women, Peace and Security Act, which says that women should be involved in the peace processes where the US is involved, and they were left out, and they continue to be left out.
And Sana, when you say that women in Afghanistan were betrayed, when you address those issues to officials here in the United States, to the administration, what is their response?
So we work both in the U.S. and internationally, and it's fascinating the kind of responses you get. For example, so often we get this message of, oh well, they say that this is the treatment of women is based on Sharia law and it's Islam, and I'm Iranian by background. There are many Muslim women and many Muslim men who have consistently said that what the Taliban is doing has got nothing to do with Islam. So then they pivot and they say, oh, but they bring up Pashto culture and it's Pashto culture and its tradition in Afghanistan and so forth. And again, if you talk to anybody who knows anything about Pashto culture or comes from Pakistan and elsewhere, they'll tell you that this has got nothing to do with that culture either. I think that one of the issues that is happening is that the Taliban is using the status of women and girls as a way of trying to push the world to give it recognition. And the world is just not paying attention because they only care about whether the Taliban is dealing with ISIS, Khorasan, and so forth. And meanwhile, half the population is being treated like slaves and pushed back into the dark ages.
Brian, the Biden administration says that it will allow tens of thousands of Afghans to enter the country, but this is all, as you've been hearing, so clouded in uncertainty that people really don't know what the future is going to be like. I mean, is this a case of the United States making promises that they were not prepared to respect or keep?
Exactly. I think when you look at the whole U.S. foreign policy towards Afghanistan since back in 1978 and 1979, you can't but come to the conclusion that the U.S. government only looks at Afghanistan through a geostrategic lens. Originally, when the CIA was supporting Osama bin Laden and the so-called freedom fighters in 78 and 79 and 1980, when the Soviets finally did come in, they were promoting the same forces that eventually gave rise to the Taliban with these horribly reactionary policies. Then when the U.S. wanted to invade Afghanistan after September 11th, women's rights, as your previous guest said, became a pretext justifying the U.S. invasion as a humanitarian gesture. Then when the Taliban offered to surrender basically in exchange for amnesty, which happened in November 2001 after they were completely defeated, Donald Rumsfeld, using this hubris and arrogance, said, we don't negotiate. And 20 years later, the group that was willing to surrender is actually taking the power from the United States, and the U.S. is basically saying, well, thank you very much, everybody. We have 240,000 dead Afghans after 20 years of occupation, women going back into this subservience under a reactionary Taliban regime. And I think the U.S. has a cynical policy. I don't think they actually care about the people in Afghanistan. Again, that was a concern or a tender concern for women, girls, and the people of Afghanistan generally, was pretextual for what was essentially a U.S. geostrategic move.
Ahmad, getting back to that withdrawal, that very chaotic withdrawal by the United States from Afghanistan, August 2021. Well, the U.S. looked back on it. They produced a report which was released last June, and that report said that the manner in which that withdrawal was carried out did have detrimental consequences. What is your assessment of that report?
I think it was chaotic. I do believe that there was a whole interagency coordination failures here in Washington. There were American citizens trapped in the country, and I did not believe in a way how it should have happened. Yeah. It happened, it caught everybody shocked, including myself. So I just think the only thing that the US and the world can take from Afghanistan is lessons learned. And going back to what happened in Sudan, and still there's a conflict going on.
Did the US learn any lessons?
I would say the allies assisted Americans to get out of Sudan, but they had the port to sea, and the Saudis got in and assisted. You know, I hope Washington can understand that when a crisis happens, you have to have a lessons learned where your staff, your people can be able to better prepare yourself. But I just want to quickly say that what happened in Afghanistan was a chaos. It was a chaotic. It was a crisis that was happening. People knew what was going on. There was a corruption. There was a political disaster in Afghanistan. I think what happened was that the world was deceived. there was these so-called experts or whatever. I mean, there's still people are saying the same thing about the Taliban, that these people have changed, their ideology has changed, they're good people, their security. These people, the same people have said the same stuff about the former government. They're good, they're progress, they brought girls to power, they brought these young kids from Washington, London, they make them to 3-star, 4-star general. Look what happened. I think it's just the lessons learned, not only on how you should get people out, but you should not let that happen. I think how the world is going to trust the world, particularly Washington, when they look at stuff like Afghanistan.
Right.
You just have to be smart who to trust, who to put in power, and who to back. I don't think U.S. went to Afghanistan to protect Afghan women, right? They went there because our national security in the U.S., we didn't want it to have another 9/11 style attack. I mean, those interests up clear.
Well, as Brian said, it's geostrategic.
It's geostrategic, and I think for that reason, right now, when it comes to Taliban, I mean, if you look at it, the whole AAA, the Afghan Adjustment Act, the SIVs, people stuck in Afghanistan, families separated, there's immigration issues, there's no passports, there's no documents. All of these issues could be resolved if the world could work with the Taliban. I think the world needs to understand, do you want to work with them or not?
Yeah.
When you look at the Afghan women in Afghanistan.
I want to get back to that point in a moment, but Omar Sadr, as we have seen so often here in the United States, there's something of a blame game that starts whenever we see a kind of foreign policy debacle like we saw in Afghanistan. We have Republicans here who blame the Biden administration for what happened, and we have Democrats who blame President Trump for what happened. How do you see it?
Exactly. Unfortunately, both parties denied the responsibility that they had vis-a-vis Afghanistan. The legacy what we are facing now is not just because of the Democrats and an incumbent party, but it started during the Trump administration. The entire peace process, which was designed, the Ambassador Khalilzad, which was appointed by President Trump to resolve this issue, it is legacy of both parties. And I think it requires both political and moral courage to acknowledge that legacy and also take certain practical steps in order to address the problem which we are facing now. It's just multifaceted. It's not just about immigrants that we are talking about now, but lives of millions of others who are facing humanitarian crisis and poverty. The previous administration, the Trump administration, also somehow left us with a legacy of very toxic rhetoric against immigration, not just about Afghanistan, but the entire system that it's broken now. It's also because of the Trump administration. And the entire 4 years under Trump, around 400 executive actions were directly targeted to immigration system. So now, for example, if those who are with F1 visa or J1 visa from Afghanistan and they cannot return back to Afghanistan, their life is under threat. But still, in the United States, they will face a crisis because either their J1 visa will get expired at some moment, or they cannot convert that J1 visa into a kind of legal permanent residence because the system is not responding as quickly as people demand.
Sanam, you were talking a moment ago about how the rights of women were used by the United States for its actions in Afghanistan. Well, if we look at some of the more dire and very tragic consequences that face women in Afghanistan right now, the UN, as well as other human rights groups, has pointed out that, I mean, they've really raised the alarm on the high number of women who have attempted suicide in Afghanistan and those who have actually killed themselves. And these investigations have shown us that it's explicitly linked to Taliban restrictions on almost every aspect of women's lives in Afghanistan. There's something like 9 in 10 women are subject to domestic violence in the country. I mean, what can you tell us about this desperate situation that women face in the country?
I think this is the irony, that everybody's talking about how much security there is and how we don't have suicide bombers anymore, but the levels of suicide amongst women are so ridiculously, tragically high. And it's one of the very few countries where women's suicide attempts are higher than men's, which is also quite a legacy for the Taliban. I wanted to just say one other thing about the question of lessons, because it's one thing to talk about what's happening in Afghanistan and the terrible treatment of women and girls, but the lessons that we're talking about have been learnt by the Houthis in Yemen, by other Islamist and jihadi groups in Philippines and Indonesia and elsewhere. I was even talking to some Israeli colleagues, and they were saying that their extremist Jewish groups are looking at the rise and the oppression of women, and saying that, you know, they're now coming forward and saying there shouldn't be women in public spaces in Israel. So it's not just the story of Afghanistan. The legacy of what we have done as the United States is terrible for Afghan women, but it's also lessons that others are learning, that if they wait and if they're violent enough, they can also win. I think that what needs to happen now is a genuine dialogue where Afghan women are at the table. One of the things also that people forget is that 65% of the Afghan population are under the age of 25. 40% were under 14 in 2021. This is a new country. And we can't just say, oh, you know, the Taliban, you know, 20 years ago, they came along and they did this and it's their tradition. The country's also changed. So they need to be at the table. The Taliban won the war. They haven't won the peace. And it's time to rethink how the dialogues take place. But young women, young people, minorities need to be part of the process of deciding their own future.
Brian Becker, has the United States really faced what happened in Afghanistan and why it was why it left the country in such chaos? I mean, would it be fair to say that the United States left Afghanistan in defeat? I mean, they went into Afghanistan after 9/11 to oust the Al-Qaeda and then the Taliban, but 20 years later, after 20 years of war, the Taliban are back in power.
Yes, the U.S. lost the war. The U.S. lost the war in Vietnam. It could not win the war in Iraq, and it lost the war in Afghanistan. And, you know, when President Obama came into office in 2009, he said, we're going to end the dumb war, that's the Iraq war, but we're going to win the Afghanistan war. And he proposed a troop surge, if we all remember, and they sent an additional 40,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan to kind of finish the job. Well, then, you know, 10 years later, the U.S. clearly has been driven out of Afghanistan. I mean, Trump was trying to negotiate a soft landing. Biden wanted to do the same. But the government that had been propped up by the United States decided not to fight. And the U.S. was done fighting because the U.S. could not win. And the U.S. was, you know, trying to fry bigger fish. The pivot to Asia and the reorientation of U.S. military doctrine away from the war on terror to major power conflict, which happened in 2018, meant the U.S. wanted to set its sights on a possible confrontation with China or Russia. So Afghanistan became sort of a domino that could fall because it wasn't critically important to the geostrategic calculations at that time. So yes, the U.S. lost the war. And, you know, what's awful about this is that for 20 years, the American people were told we must keep fighting in Afghanistan. So much is at stake. The rights of the Afghan people, the rights of Afghan girls, our own security, everything is so hinged on Afghanistan and the outcome of that war. And as soon as the U.S. decided to leave, boom, the media stopped paying attention. Politicians turned away. It was no longer a big point of interest on social media. The U.S. just closed its eyes to it and moved on to the next conflict. I mean, war after war after war for the United States, and each of these disasters, and I would say Vietnam's a disaster. 2 million people died in Vietnam.
Yeah.
I mean, look at all of these disasters, and the U.S. government just turns away, cynically says, you know, we hate the Taliban. We're not going to give them their money back. In addition to Afghan women and girls not having any rights, right now a lot of people don't have food because the U.S. won't provide Afghanistan with its own assets. This is a disastrous type of foreign policy.
Okay, Ahmad, I want to get back to something you were talking about a moment ago, and that is how to deal with the Taliban. There was a piece in Foreign Policy, I think it was Foreign Affairs, just not so long ago. It was written by Javed Ahmad, who's a former Afghan ambassador to the United States. And he says in that piece that it's time to recognize the Taliban. He says the absence of any kind of U.S. diplomatic presence in Afghanistan actually leaves Washington powerless.
I think the Taliban media coverage and their targeted attack is working on that former ambassador, Javed. I don't think you should recognize the Taliban. I think you should first understand what is your grand strategy in South Asia. What do you want to do in Afghanistan? Once you do that, you have to accept Taliban are the same people back in 1990s. I don't really understand why the people didn't understand that. Their ideology has never changed. They are part of a group of Afghans who are conservative. That's a fact. That's a true. And now they want to bring all these other stuff on top of women and other religious and cultural issues, targeting minorities and Shia religious minority groups, because they represent themselves, the Taliban, another ethnic group, and you're trying to impose their values on other people, which is a big red flag. So Afghanistan does not have a Taliban problem, they have a woman problem, and that's part of their culture. You look at the back history, I mean, the past 100 years.
How do you mean they have a woman problem?
They have a woman problem because that's part of rooted in the culture. If you look at 1960s, 1970s, those pictures people...
Denial of education is rooted in the culture, you say?
What I'm saying is that there are different ethnic groups in Afghanistan has different values and the way they have, there's some custom tradition.
Yeah.
And Taliban are part of one specific group. I'm not talking maybe all over our Taliban, but that is the backbone. People need to understand that's who the Taliban are. They want the woman to wash dishes, be at home, deliver babies. So if you accept that, then work with the Taliban. And as the Ambassador Javed said, then recognize them, yes, of course. But if you want democracy, freedom, you want women to work, you want women to have a voice, and girls be able to go to school, 2 years. Look at the actions of the Taliban. When I say work like the Taliban, deal like the Taliban, I mean, I was involved in the Afghan peace process. 2018, I was in Afghanistan, I saw the whole thing was unfolding. What the Taliban are doing is you're targeting the world that we are changing.
Okay.
They have a specific approach. The world needs to be harsh on the Taliban. That if you want to work with us, then you have to act like us. Or if you don't want to act like us, at least respect human rights.
Okay.
Which Taliban are not doing.
Omar, I want to get to you for your view on this subject that we're talking about right now. Unfortunately, I've only got about 30 seconds left. I mean, does the United States, or any other power for that matter, have any leverage with the Taliban?
I think past 2 years of Taliban governance and past 30 years of lived experience with Taliban shows no. United States and the region surrounding Afghanistan has very limited leverage on the Taliban. Of course, United States sends money, which is over $1 million per week, to the Taliban government, and that provides certain leverage, but that has not changed a tangible result in terms of what we demand from the Taliban in terms of changing the model of governance or inclusivity or respecting human rights. So that's why I think that's a failure.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it for now. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.